A lot of people were looking for some glimmer of hope in the 2012 Republican National Convention. They were hoping that the Ron Paul delegates or the Ron Paul candidacy might at least be able to get into the party some glimmer of hope that the party might have a future in the liberty cause, that it was reversing its tendency towards totalitarianism and socialism and neoconservatism, which I don't consider conservatism at all. Of course, they were very disappointed in what they saw. What they saw was that Ron Paul was not allowed to speak, and in fact, he had enough states to be nominated, but they took delegates away from him arbitrarily and gave them to Romney so that he would not have a majority in the necessary number of states in order to put his name into nomination. So he was denied the ability to have his name placed even in nomination, because that would have been embarrassing to Romney, because what that would have meant was that votes for Ron Paul would have been counted. And of course the Romney people wanted things to be very easy on the first ballot. Now what does this all mean? What are we to make of all this? The Republican Party has shown that they're not favorable to grassroots efforts. In fact, they changed the rules to make it even harder for someone running a grassroots campaign to be nominated. They've increased the number of states that someone has to carry in order for their name to be nominated. So a third-party candidate or a dark horse candidate is virtually impossible. In other words, they're setting the stage so that only the major candidates that have the big funding can, in fact, go through the nominating process to the convention. They've basically shown us what they're made of. They've shown us what the future of the Republican Party is, and it's more of the same. The Republican Party is not going to reform itself from within. And so I think this in some ways should hearten the liberty movement, that the answer is not going to come from the Republican establishment. It's not going to come through politics in general. But I think we should be refreshed that there were a lot of people in this election who stood for liberty, but a lot of people just wanted it to come down to anybody that might have a chance to beat the incumbent. A lot of people wanted it to come down with, let's just get behind somebody who might beat the incumbent. And I think that's unfortunate that a lot of Christians have come out so strenuously in favor of some of the neoconservative candidates and very much against the one candidate who did, in fact, stand for liberty. The only candidate in recent memory who has really stood for reducing the size of the government and trying to bring our federal debt under control. Frankly, I think we would have to agree that had Ron Paul been elected, there wasn't a great deal he could do. He would be fighting an uphill battle, but at least was willing to fight the battles that needed to be fought. Instead, we're going to kick the can further down the road. Even Ron Paul has admitted that the United States cannot pay off its debts. It cannot pay for all the things that it has promised, which is far more than the $16 trillion or whatever they estimated. It's probably closer to 8 or 10 times that, because those figures don't include all the things we have promised to future generations that are not yet payable. So the amount of our obligations is really astronomical, and we're going to renege on them. At some point, things are going to come to a crisis. We don't know when that is going to be. The banking crisis of 2008 was just a precursor to what's going to happen in this country. And what route are we going to go? As long as we pick presidents who are more of the same, one of the things we have to fear is when the crisis comes is that there'll be a tendency to move towards absolutism, towards statism, towards complete control of the economy. An alternative would be to chuck the promises, say we can't pay for all this stuff. It never was possible. We're facing a repudiation of our debt in one way or another. But are we also facing the possibility of even more statist control and the complete destruction of American liberties? Otto Scott once said something to me years ago. He said Americans are a short-tempered people, and when Americans get angry, they get mean. And by that he meant that when Americans turn, they turn. I can remember when we were all in favor of our war supporting Saddam Hussein against Iran. And then within a few years, we were all in favor of a war against Saddam Hussein. And so Americans can turn very, very quickly. And because the American people now don't have the character they once had, they may get very ugly. So I think things could change. There's been talk for many years about a revolution. Well, I don't look forward to the prospect of Americans getting angry and what that could mean. And I don't think we necessarily need to think in terms of an armed revolution. I don't think that's probably a likely scenario. But what are all these unprincipled Americans who are used to handouts that suddenly come to the realization that it's all been a fraud? What's going to happen at that point? And that's something we don't know. And that's why the message of Christians has to be one that is honest. We can't be like a doctor who protects the patient from the news that they're terminally ill. At one point, doctors really did that. It was common practice. Don't tell the patient, don't tell the family the real situation. They can't handle it. Now that's unheard of, but it was once common. Well, as Christians, we have to speak the truth, even when it hurts, even when people don't want to hear it. At least we then have credibility. And I think one of the reasons I respect Ron Paul, and I don't consider myself a philosophical libertarian, but I respect him because he told the truth. He was honest and he was consistent. And it's been a long time since anybody in American politics has been as consistent and as honest as he had. And I think that's going to bode well for his reputation in the future. I think that's going to bode well for the liberty movement in the future. And I think the problems that the Republicans and the Democrats have cut out for themselves are going to be insurmountable. We don't know what the future holds, but we do know that God controls the future. I'm not a pessimist theologically, and so I try not to be a pessimist politically. I believe that God has great things in our future and in the future of the world. I'm a post-millennialist, so I believe these problems are temporary and they're problems of man's making, and they aren't going to interfere with the kingdom of God, and that we don't know what the political world holds for us in the next 4 years or the next 8 years or the next 20 years. But we do know that the fraud that is now our federal government can't go on. We know the economic manipulation cannot go on. We know that the lust for power always ends in disaster for those who seek it. And so we have to move on, and we have to hope and pray that in some small way all this is going to contribute, as we know it will, to the furtherance of the kingdom of God and His Son, Jesus Christ. All things work together for good, and sometimes things have to get to a crescendo before they collapse. I think that's what we're approaching. But good things are going to come out if there are more and more people willing to stand for what's true, for what's right, and to speak the truth.